Chamaya. It's like papaya, except it's not. And this is Plot Twist Please. Welcome. So, today I'm going to talk about the anti-intellectualism that I've been seeing on TikTok lately and what I think all of this means. So, if you don't know, this is a place where I like to talk about mental health and media and the intersection of those things. I like to talk about large cultural themes too, here and there, and this is going to be on the side of like the theoretical things. So I've got all of my notes. I'm going to make sure to put them in the show notes this time. I really have been forgetting, but I'm going to go back and do that for the rest of the episodes too. I'm going to put the sources and the articles and the things that I've referenced in the show notes and into the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Also, I'm so sorry about the sound quality of these podcast episodes lately. I am trying to get this fixed. I'm getting a new microphone over this winter break, and so I'm excited for that to come in and for me to have better quality audio for y'all. So let's get into it. Before we have this discussion, I thought to myself, well, who is intellectualism for? Because I think that that's one of the main questions that people are asking when they're making comments like, people using these big words is just trying to show off or just trying to puff up their ego. But okay, I don't know. Let's interrogate that a little bit. Let's see where that comes from. So if we look at a lot of abstract art, like a lot of modern art in particular, or even a lot of historical art, there is this TikToker who commented on how a lot of abstract art seems like, you know, a kindergartner could do it. Yet and still people pay thousands of dollars for these pieces of art to hang in their homes. When you see these pieces of art in museums, they are just raised to such high esteem, you know, in terms of like the description that's usually below it. It's this elaborate think piece on what the piece of art represented and why it's significant. And that has a lot of like historical relevance there when it comes to history and studying, you know, culture. You know what, hey. But one could also argue that there's a lot of elitism involved in the abstract art or even in, you know, visual art space. People pay thousands of dollars to go to university to learn how to make that kind of art. People who have access or even means to go study art are usually people who live in an elite tax bracket or, you know, whose families were exposed to a certain amount of money at an early age, or they could even consider an art form as a liable or worthwhile area of study when they get to college. I went to school to study theater as well as business, but the fact that I was going to study theater is a privilege in itself. The fact that there are people who go to school who pay thousands of dollars in tuition a year, who pay like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, now at this point $90,000 a year to study art in any art form might be considered wild to someone who cannot afford to get a higher education at all. And, you know, let alone to do something that doesn't have an immediate return on investment. There's not immediate income promised as soon as you graduate. There's nothing promised when you graduate if you have a theater degree or if you go for visual art. And one could argue that there's nothing promised anyway. Now, if you go to college, like you've got to get a master's for something to be promised. But I'm using that example just to point out how much privilege there is in even being that well-versed in an artistic field. I do resent this idea, but I do think that certain people, and I'm going to get into who those people are, that certain people dislike when someone breaks down film or when someone breaks down something as seemingly simple as a Disney movie scene or feel important, either culturally or, you know, socially or politically. But when someone centers that within like an intellectual argument, when someone makes that the subject of a study, I think that certain people get upset about that because in their opinion, there are some things that are just to be enjoyed, allow us to kind of turn our brains off a little bit. But I would argue, as someone who went to school for art, that people study film for a reason. There's film school for a reason. People pay money to learn animation for a reason. And I'd argue the same about literature. Like, yes, it can seem really highfalutin and elitist. Literature can, and I'm going to get into the details of how and why it can be. I guess the conversations around literature can feel very elitist. But I would argue too that there is a craftsmanship that goes into writing a good book, that goes into writing captivating stories. You have to learn how to do that. And even if you don't have to learn through paying thousands and thousands of dollars a year. You have to learn through practice. There are things you need to get better at in order to do that successfully, in order to tell a story successfully, or to tell a story that resonates with a lot of people. Except when someone seems to over-intellectualize social media, or when people on social media seem to be speaking in less like colloquialisms, or tend to be used like large terminology, start to reference text of people who have researched. There are certain people who get upset about that, who don't want that coming across their screens, who just want to hear a fun song or see a cool dance. And that's fine, but I'd argue that too, social media too deserves to be studied. There's a craftsmanship behind that too. So I'm saying all that to basically support my opinion, my thesis, that intellectualism in itself may not necessarily be the problem. At the same time, though, I recognize that the people who hate on intellectualism may have a point. So what do I mean? Look, I'm someone who decided to come on YouTube, a place where people are literally trying different foods and seeing if they throw up. Like I get it. It's not lost on me that what I'm doing here can seem silly to some people. Like, it's not lost on me that whether I was doing this or I was trying on outfits, that someone was going to think it was silly. Like, someone was going to not like it or be annoyed by it. But at the same time, I am someone who has always wanted to know more. I've always wanted to know why. And I know that there are people out there who feel the same way about these things that seem like they don't matter. Someone somewhere at some point had to say, hey, this thing actually does matter, and this is something that we actually need to look into for there to be media studies. Someone had to look at the way that people's food digests and say, hey, that actually does kind of matter, or I actually want to know more about that for us to study the digestive system. Like, and I'm not saying that like coming on here and talking about TV shows is to the level of importance of the medical field and of like getting a PhD and learning how to like cut open bodies. But I do think that it reveals something about us, about humans who live on a floating rock, where some people are not interested at all in asking the question why, as to why certain things happen. Let's talk about how people get to that point, though. Let's talk about how that happens. And like, hey, like that's the thing too. Like, we wouldn't know we lived on a floating rock unless somebody went, hey, do we live? Where are we? Where are we actually? Why is the sun over there and the moon over there at this point in time? Somebody had to have questions. And when they had those questions, they saw answers. Or they asked someone that question and that person saw answers. Like, come on now, come on. Like, there has to be some level of curiosity for us to be able to expand what we know about the world. And as someone who is living in an era where the digital space is so vast and has become such a central part of everyone's life who has access to it, of course this stuff is interesting to me. Of course this stuff is important to me. There are children being born now who know how to work an iPad before they know how to say their name. Like, of course it's important. And at the same time, maybe it doesn't matter. Like, you know, it's like I do have to have that double mind consciousness to know that the things that I care about, some people are just not going to give a flying hoot. Some people are just going to go about their day. And that's just the spoonful I'm going to have to swallow. Okay? Now, what makes someone hate intellectualism? Finally getting to this point. Well, one thing I'm theorizing is someone's values. So whether it's the values that someone grew up with or the values that someone has fallen into based on the circumstances of their life. I went through this rabbit hole of you know, trying to understand the Black people who voted for Trump and trying to understand that, as I am not a Black person who voted for Trump, but as I am not someone who had advocated for voting for Trump. I finally came to the conclusion through watching all these videos, through watching all these debates. There were a few reasons as to why Black people voted for Trump that I could potentially understand. One of those reasons is values. There were lots of people who were talking about how much they want to have a legacy for their family and how they wanted financial security for themselves and to own property and, you know, to invest and how Trump's values or Trump's goals aligned with theirs. These are people who definitely valued, in my opinion, basically the acquisition of individual property now, as opposed to being invested in collective humanity long term. In particular, there was this one woman on this episode of Vice. It's a media platform where they host really interesting conversations of people from, you know, seemingly opposing sides. So when I'm talking about individual property, I'm talking about the acquisition of wealth, land, like actual land, because if you're in real estate, you know that land is wealth. And it's definitely, in my opinion, a short-term outlook. Because what they're saying is, I want to live this certain lifestyle, like I want to have this private jet, I want to live in this house, I want my kids to have this kind of income, I want, like, those are the values that they have. But then you have people who are looking past now, they're looking past the acquisition of wealth, and they're saying, okay, you may have a mansion now, but we won't have a planet in 10 years. It's this opposition of the goals that people have. And what I'm finding too is that the people who are seeking wealth tend to be the people who are most seeking survival, the most financially unstable.
Quick edit here. I am by no means claiming that the only people who voted for Trump were poor or people who did not have access to information. Because we all know, a lot of wealthy white people voted for Trump. What I am saying is that there is correlation between lack of valuing intellectualism and having lack of resources or lack of time and lack of capital. And I'm also not saying that this is exclusive to Black people, and I'm not saying that being a minority automatically means that you probably don't value intellectualism. What I'm saying is that there's symmetry there. Also, wealthy people are just as money hungry as poor people, but where poor people sit is in a place of scarcity. That's all. All right, as you were.
It is easier to offer someone a baby carrot for dinner if they are starving. It is easier to get someone in a scarcity mindset to settle for breadcrumbs. It's appealing. And you know what, even as I think a lot of people who voted for Trump, and this is kind of going on a tangent, but kind of not, stay with me, stick with me. A lot of people who voted for Trump really thought that Trump was one of them, really thought that he was someone who built himself up from the bottom. There are things that I'm not going to discuss as it pertains to the Trump administration, but these people perceived him to be like them, or rather they perceived him to be someone they could become. The second reason that I think that a lot of these people were falling on the Trump support side is because of the lack of free time versus disposable time. So when I say that, I mean that white collar workers, people with small businesses, those are people who were most likely to vote for Trump. And, in terms of like demographics, those are most of the people who ended up voting for him. Not saying that, the top 1% wasn't completely in his bag, not saying that at all. But I am saying that for a lot of people, for a lot of white collar workers, for a lot of small business owners, for a lot of people who were struggling financially, for a lot of lower class Americans, people who did not have time to do deep research on a daily basis, they were the people who weren't reading, peer-reviewed studies because they had to get up in the morning and go to work. And then when they got home from work, they had to be exhausted, go to bed, and then wake up and do it again. Some people just do not value intellectualism because they do not have the time or the energy to value intellectualism. When people are out here trying to survive, they're not going to sit here thinking about the theory of commodification for hours. There's no time. Now, when we're talking about community, a lot of people who ended up voting for Trump, a lot of Black people specifically, ended up getting ostracized by a lot of members of the Black community. People they grew up with, their loved ones, their family members. And I honestly think that's the worst thing that could have happened, because I think that a lot of those people found community in extremely conservative circles because there was nowhere else for them to go. It's a similar line of progression with people who end up being in cults, or people who end up, falling into the manosphere on the internet. And this is something that is consistent with human beings. This is something that I promise you can take to the bank. This is ChamayaOlogy. People are going to go where the love is. People are going to go where they feel welcomed. If you are not welcoming them, they are not going to stay there. That they're not going to stay there. That is something that is just across the board. I swear, it's everywhere. When you think about religion, when you think about cults, you think about different subgroups of people who have been able to attract certain people, it is because the love is there, community is there. And I think that a lot of people who have found themselves hating on intellectualism have found intellectualism to be very ostracizing. And people who are telling them these facts or using these, what they perceive as big words are using them kind of to posture themselves above them, are using them as to kind of have a gotcha, and not necessarily calling them in, but trying to embarrass them. And a lot of the time trying to embarrass them publicly, especially on the internet. That ain't it. That is not it. That's not gonna help anything but your ego. Yeah, and that's honestly something that I've had to learn too, as someone who is a public commentator who goes online and like does the thing and talks to the people who I don't know online, who I disagree with. I have had to realize that people are not going to respond to animosity. They're not going to want to hear your point if you're telling them that they're stupid. Like they're not going to want to hear your side. Oh Lord. Okay, I was supposed to use some of my notes here. Okay. Okay. This idea of anti-intellectualism is not something that has just sprung up because of TikTok. Ever since people could read and write, anti-intellectualism was always there. I'm going to read this excerpt right now from Dissent Magazine about how language wasn't inherently ever elitist, but of how people in powerful positions have made it elitist. In 1963, the historian Richard Hofstadter, published Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, in which he traced a recurring mode of thought. So basically what I think is really key here is that he creates this parallel between hatred of intellectualism and the class divide. So reading on, different forms of anti-intellectualism have different purposes and different roots, and there is danger in mistaking genuinely democratic impulses for wholesale assaults on the life of the mind. So what he's saying here, basically, is that there are different purposes for anti-intellectualism. In some contexts, it makes sense. In some contexts, it doesn't. And I happen to agree with him. We shouldn't conflate someone saying, hey, language can be elitist with someone saying, I hate big words. Because sometimes that's not what they're saying. So in order to do that, you have to acknowledge that language has been used as a weapon against poor people or against people who did not have access to it. We know this. There's a reason why people didn't want slaves to read. There's a reason why once Frederick Douglass learned how to write, he became a danger to capitalism. Ooh, and here's the thing, y'all. I learned something really sad about Frederick Douglass that made me not like him so much. Oh, God. But that's another video. But basically, when Black people started getting the ability to write, the institution of slavery was in trouble. The last thing that I think could potentially make someone turn the corner into anti-intellectualism is the expectation of the space that the intellectualism is being presented in. Let me break that down. When you are watching a TikTok and someone's like dancing, doing their thing, it's very light, there's a very specific audience. A lot of the time, people aren't trying to hear a dissertation. A lot of the time, people aren't trying to hear complex theories, research takes on that video specifically at that time. Like maybe you can put that video in a context of a larger, form of work, like a video on YouTube, right? But no one, I don't think is like expecting someone to write a whole essay in the comment section. You kind of have to just know your audience. Like you kind of have to know who's willing to hear and where they're willing to hear. And that's not to discourage deep thought on the internet, because there's lots of talks to be had. I think we just have to acknowledge that, like, whether or not someone is used to engaging with a subject in a certain way has a huge impact on how well that subject is received. What I also think is interesting is that the Marxist theory of commodity fetishism, which I just started delving into when I was doing research for this video, has a lot to do with this phenomenon of people taking something really, product-based, someone taking something really at face value versus someone who is seeing that product and trying to ask questions like why and how. If you don't know what Marxist theory of commodity fetishism is, there's a really great video that breaks it down into really simple terms. I put the link in the description. But basically, commodity fetishism is the relationship that people have with products versus with other people. And so what typically happens is, through capitalism, through the process of buying and selling, what happens is people start paying attention more to the actual product in their hand versus who is making that product, what their lives are like, how much they're earning when they make that product. The same reason that I am filming on my cell phone that was probably made through really morally dubious, morally corrupt means. So it's one of those things that is a result of taking things at face value rather than asking why and how. But see, if you are someone who immediately when someone is asking why and how, you claim that they're being elitist, that's a problem. And if your main reason for interrogating their use of big words or their intellectualism is you do not want to be bothered, that's a problem, because you have your own pride and you don't want someone calling you out on the things that you don't know. That's different. Now let's talk about when it's useful to use elitist language. I think it's useful for signaling specificity. If there are lots of words in the English dictionary, and there are very specific words that users use for very specific things. Like, me being happy is different than me being excited, but it's more specific. It's a more specific way to communicate. You know, it gets across something that's very, how many times can I say the word specific? That's specific. I think there are definitely uses for words that are getting to the core of what someone means, especially when we're talking about, you know, disability awareness, especially when we're talking about Blackness and socio-political issues. There are certain words that describe very specific phenomenons, and the only way to communicate exactly what we're talking about is by using these agreed upon terms that scholars have used, that we've been able to use to connect exact actions. It doesn't have the same ring as the word specific though, so I'm gonna just keep using the word specific because it is specifically what I mean. It can also signal expertise. You know, if someone is trying to explain heart surgery to me on the internet, I don't know why I would need to know it, but if someone is trying to explain it, someone saying I cut open the person with a tool, I'm not gonna think you're a heart surgeon. I'm gonna think you played operator once. There are reasons why people go to school and get these credentials and have these levels of expertise. Yes, there are barriers to entry when it comes to that stuff. Yes, there's elitism attached to pedigree. There is elitism attached to higher education and attached to credentials, but they're credentials for a reason. Two things can exist at the same time. I need us to acknowledge that. I also think that elitist quote language is useful when we're digging deeper into subjects that are usually washed over, like when we're talking about media. We need to talk about the white gaze. It's important to talk about things like that. It's important to talk about inspiration porn when it comes to people with disabilities. These are not terms that we necessarily knew when we were participating in them for the first time. But once people have studied what has been done over and over again, we develop terms for them. And those terms allow us to have conversations about patterns. Now, when is this kind of language not useful? Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes we be doing a little too much. Politics and social issues. I am of the school of thought that sometimes when we're trying to be, extra intellectual and we're trying to show how someone is wrong on the internet about a social or political issue, what we end up doing is ostracizing that person because we're using terms that we know they don't understand. We're using terms that we know they don't have the context to be able to put into their perspective. And so then it's not useful. There's a quote, where is it? A quote that Toni Morrison has about how the term racism is a distraction. And I feel that, because what happens when someone hears the term racism, who is not used to being in those kinds of discussions, or discussions that center racism, and is not used to interrogating that part of themselves, the internalized racist part of themselves, what happens is they turn their ears off. What happens is they immediately think that your point is invalid because all they understand about racism is Jim Crow. All they understand about racism is trigger warning, is slavery. And if something doesn't look like slavery, if something doesn't emulate that image, they're like, can't be racism. And you know what? More people think that way than you think. More people think that than you think. And the way to really have these conversations is to talk about structure, is to talk about anti-Blackness as a whole, as a global thing, because it is a global thing, and talk about how systems of oppression happen and how systems of oppression are able to prevail. That is how you talk about it, because I know it sucks, but the term racism will keep you explaining forever. And then nothing gets done because we're stuck explaining. There's also very specific instances where I think, these might go without saying, but I think medical accessibility or medical literacy is something that absolutely needs to be broken down when we're talking about it in the public space. Like when we're talking about it on the internet, or even with people who are not in the medical field, I think it has to be broken down so that people can literally have access to the information that they need to know. I didn't go to medical school. Before making certain videos, I have to look up a lot of stuff so that I can make sure that my information is not only accurate, but that it is broken down to a level that can make the average person who did not go to medical school, who does not interact with these texts all the time, understand. Another area that I think elitist language is just not necessary is through clout chasing or through having discussions about oppression where there's no actual desire to address the oppression. Like when we're having these panels, and I think this was big during the Black Lives Matter movement when at its first, combustion, when a lot of people were like, we're going to have these conversations, we're going to host these panels, we're going to, have these town hall meetings. And it was a lot of talking. It was a lot of this. And I also want to draw your attention to, oh my gosh, an article that just blew my mind. The article is called Being in the Room Privilege, Elite Capture and Epistemic Defference. So if you don't know, oh God, I gotta hurry. All right, epistemology is the study of how we distinguish people's opinions from people's facts. Like how do we know if this person's thoughts are rooted in facts or if it's just a random person's thoughts? Like how do we know if this take is legitimate? Epistemology. So basically what this person is arguing is, from a societal standpoint, the most affected by the social injustices we associate with politically important identities like gender, class, race, and nationality are disproportionately likely to be incarcerated, underemployed, or part of the 44% of the world's population without internet access, and thus both left out of the rooms of power and largely ignored by the people in the rooms of power. All that is saying, there's this idea, which I don't think is at its core flawed, but there's an idea in conversations about oppression that we are supposed to elevate the people who are suffering from oppression the most so that they can speak to their personal experiences, to their legitimate experiences. There's also the issue of those people literally not being able to get into the rooms where people are having these discussions because of literacy issues, because of not getting the degrees to get the PhD, because they couldn't afford to get the PhD, or because this public school system is broken and didn't really cater to their minds. It didn't really nurture their minds the way that it did to the kids in private school who could get that PhD in 10 years and could speak at these summits and could speak at these conferences for the people who are suffering the most. Like, do you understand what I'm saying? The people who we're trying to center are not going to get there because they're so disenfranchised. In order for us to hear accounts of slavery, in order for us to be able to read those accounts, there are slaves who had to learn how to write. So like what I'm saying is there are so many stories we did not get to hear because they are not the slaves who got the privilege to learn how to write and to learn how to read. There are so many stories we will never know. That is what I'm saying. And the people who are the Black intellectuals, like the Frederick Douglasses, the people who ended up sharing their stories to the masses were the most elite of Black people. And that is saying something. Their experiences are the only ones we know. I think that's a good way to close out this episode because it is very complicated. Language can be elitist, but I think language is also so crucial to understanding people's experiences and to understanding these larger theoretical concepts. That's all I'm trying to say, y'all. I gotta go. I'm about to make my family late for this function. It's fine. We gotta do. Stay weird. Like, share, and subscribe. And happy holidays. Bye.